name is George Gamoda, and I'm kind of the unofficial organizer for the commemoration of the end of World War I. Which started out like a small group of, I think, 3 or 4 people. Now we have 25 people, 12 organizations, and it's going to be a 6-week-long journey through history, and hopefully in between we'll have some fun things to do. First of all, I want to thank Erica McAvoy, standing back there, the director of the Historical Society. She's rather new, but now, what, a year here. So she's an invaluable person that I have helping, and all the staff from the Historical Society, the Celebrations Committee, the Veterans, the Boy Scouts, and, you name it. And I'm sorry if I'm missing some, but you all have been really great. Now we have 5 lectures. This is the first one, the kickoff lecture. The last one is on November 6th, and I hope that you can enjoy as many as you can. We're very fortunate that we're going to have Lex Media here, and if you want to hear or see the lecture over again, it will be linked to our World War I website. So it will be available probably for 6 months, or who knows, depends on the traffic. We're going to have 3 festive events. The first one is October 19th, which is a gala, and it really sounds like it's going to be a great thing. And all I can say is, if you're interested, sign up, because the seats are going fast. We have a capacity, I think, of like 130 or 35, and we're now at 90, and it's been only advertised for a few days. On November 9th, we're going to have a festive Songs of World War I. It's a event that we're going to celebrate, a little dancing, songs. It's free to the public, but you need to sign up because we have limited capacity here in the depot. And then the Lexington Symphony is going to have a event on November 10th, which will play selected themes from World War I. The finale, and it started a year and a half ago, and now here I am talking about the finale, but the finale is going to be November 11th. The whole town is going to celebrate. Today, as you see the banners going up, and if you haven't seen them, just look up and you'll see Stanley Hill there with his camera. The finale is going to have a parade, but first of all the churches will ring their bells just like 100 years ago. At the end of the war, the armistice at 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918, church bells rang throughout the United States. We will here in Lexington repeat that on November 11, 2018. Then there are going to be exhibits. The exhibits are available now to be seen at the library. They're still being put up, community center, but there'll be more exhibits at Cary Hall, and you'll be able to go and see them. The parade. This year we're going to have a special, because we in Lexington had 373 volunteers, quote unquote, who went to war. Of those 373, unfortunately, 8 perished. And those are the fallen 8, and you can see them on the CVS exhibits. Unfortunately, we're missing 2 images. So if anybody knows descendants of the 2 guys, we really like to have. But the descendants of the 373 have been contacted thanks to an Eagle Scout by the name of a young man, Daniel Yoon, and some of his friends spent hours trying to go through phone books and finding descendants. They found about 150. And so we're going to invite them. In fact, the selectmen this past Monday signed a letter inviting the descendants to come to Lexington and participate in the parade, which I think will be a great thing. High school is participating. We're going to have essays, and the best ones are going to be shown at Cary Hall on November 11th. So as you can see, there's going to be a great amount of talk about World War I. Hopefully, a lot of lessons learned will be taught during that time, because it wasn't the war that ended all wars. In fact, it probably spawned more wars. But being that as it may, I want to be able to get on with the talk, because you didn't come here to hear me talk. I would like to introduce Paran Dang, who's going to introduce the speaker. Paran is somebody that you probably know, especially if you're from the Indian American community. He's the founder of IAL and is a good friend of the society, and we're really delighted that he helped essentially get this thing going to us. Paran?
Good evening. It's my great honor, and I thank Lexington Historical Society and in collaboration with Indian Americans of Lexington. And some of our members are here, and I am so very glad that we are having this event, which was a big war and in which so many soldiers perished. Some 1.3 million soldiers were sent from India, and 70,000 of them died in that war. I don't want to take thunder out of Professor Louro's presentation, and she will tell you much more about that. But I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of IAL and on behalf of, like George said, Lexington Historical Society. This is the most sacred place, close to the green, close to the statue, the people who died for our freedom. Martin Luther King once said, "No one really knows why they are alive. No one really knows why they are alive until they know what they would like to die for." So, there is a lot of wisdom in this, that living one doesn't realize that why we are living, but when you realize or when you feel what I would like to die for. So those soldiers, they died for their country, they died for freedom. And in this place, which is a symbol of freedom, this is a very, very nice beginning of the few lectures, like George said, that we are going to have on World War I. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker of the evening, Professor Michelle Louro. She is a professor at Salem State University with her PhD and other degrees, and her great expertise and her research is focused on Indian subcontinent, Asia, and those places. And above all, it's my great pleasure to feel that in 2008 and 2009, she was in New Delhi as a Fulbright scholar to do research for a year. So she is very familiar to the town where I lived and my home is there. And those, if somebody from New Delhi, she was used to live in Defense Colony, which is a very nice area. And, you know, she will tell you more about the war, but she is so much interested in this subject and about India that she has written a book. I think it has been published, Nehru and the how he stood for finishing these imperial dominations and colonies and stuff like that. So she has a number of research papers. She has a couple of books, and she is constantly working. And this is our great honor that she is here, and she'll be telling you all about the First World War, how it came about and how it happened, and how people survived and died. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm applause to Professor Louro.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I am so excited about the full house. Thanks to the Lexington Historical Society, to the Indian Americans of Lexington for inviting me to share a little piece of India's story in World War I. I'm just thrilled that everyone here is engaged in thinking about history. I think now more than ever, historical knowledge is so important to our world, not just even our country. So this is really exciting. I'm a history professor at Salem State University. I teach courses on modern India, modern South Asia more broadly, the British Empire, and also world history. And I'm actually really active in the World History Association, both in the New England area as well as the International World History Association. So my love of world history and my love of Indian history is really represented today in talking about world wars and India. So I am really honored to launch this series. I think this is an excellent topic to begin to think about World War I. And what I'd like to start by saying is that the First World War was immeasurably shaped by India in ways that historians are just coming to grasp with, and ways that our culture has not quite caught up with. So that's sort of my first point that I'd like to make, is that the First World War was really dramatically shaped by India. And the second is that India was dramatically and immeasurably shaped by the First World War. And so those are the two focuses that I'll have today. I'll spend some time talking about India's commitment in terms of soldiers, as well as in terms of economic materials and resources. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the outcomes of the war shaped India's history in the 1920s through to the Second World War. And so I want to begin with sort of an anecdotal story. I'm a bit of a storyteller, and actually I should also add the caveat that my own research is really on the 20s and 30s rather than the First World War. So I'm going to try to answer all of your battle questions and specific details about the First World War. I do know a fair amount about it, but I'm really interested in my own research and the outcomes of that war and how that shaped the world and India's place within it. Okay. So if India immeasurably shaped the war, what is most interesting in both world wars, I would say, I think what's really interesting and striking is the absence of India in stories about either of the world wars. Just last year, a popular and Oscar-winning film on World War II, Dunkirk, was released. Many of you are nodding your head, you've probably seen it. It recounted the evacuation of Allied troops from the northern coast of France in 1940. It was acclaimed, well-received, nominated for an Oscar, and won some technical awards for cinematography. In July, it also opened in India, and it broke records for an English language only film. So in other words, it wasn't dubbed in any other language. It came out as an English release, but it broke records as one of the most popular films of English language only releases, and made $2.4 million in its opening in India. What's really interesting, as one historian notes, is that the film ignores the significance of Indians in Dunkirk, in particular in World War II, as well as in World War I. And another historian said that the appearance of Indian soldiers would have, quote, provided a good reminder of how utterly central the role of the Indian Army was in the war. Now, if India's role is poorly understood in World War II, I would arguably say it's even less understood in World War I. So it's one of my concerns today to talk a bit more about and highlight the contributions that India made in the context of World War I, and as well as highlight some of the experiences of those Indian soldiers. How did Indians live through World War I? And then I want to talk about how others outside of the Army also experienced World War I. So these are kinds of the outline of what I'm going to do. I also realized, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that picture at all. I also, so this picture is actually archival images of Indians at Dunkirk. So to sort of reveal the importance that they were there's plenty of documentary evidence in the archives of the importance of the Indians that served there in the evacuation of France in 1940. So as I was circulating and talking to some of you, and I hope I get to chat with many more of you in the question and answer and maybe afterwards, what I began to realize is that this is sort of the topic. More broadly speaking, we want to put India in World War I, but we also want to think about it as a global war. And this is, it's a map, it's by Pearson, it's a textbook map for world history, but it shows troop deployments and movements during the Great War. When I ask my students to look at it, I often say, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And of course it's that, wow, this really was a global war. And yet at the same time, we spend most of our time thinking about the Western Front, the stories of European poems, or European survivors, their poems, their literature, their recounting of those stories. And so it's really important to remember that the Great War was always a global war, and that there were the mobilization of lives of soldiers as well as non-combatants was really critical, and it was really, truly global in that sort of sense. The focuses of the war on the horrors of the Western Front and the battles of the Western Front certainly did determine in many ways the origins and outcomes of the wars, but the global scale of the war points to campaigns in North Africa, in the Pacific, in what is today the Middle East, but was Ottoman territory, as well as Europe, and of course from the United States. There were 27 belligerent nations in the First World War, fighting in Africa and in the Pacific, as well as the current day Middle East as in Europe. It was massive in scale. At least 10 million died, and those are just soldiers. 20 million were injured, and 7 to 10 million civilians died in the process. It was really a war, and I understand that you're going to have somebody talk a bit about the technology, but it was a war in which industrial technology was made use in unique ways. While we mastered industrial ways of producing goods, what we did in the First World War is master the ways in which industrial products could destroy as quickly as possible through things like machine guns and tanks. And so it really did produce some of the real weapons, the first weapons of mass destruction in catastrophic ways. The First World War also reshaped the world map. several large empires collapsed: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, when Russia withdrew and the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Tsar. New states and colonies emerged in its wake. Some problems that created the First World War were solved, and many more were created. And so we can think about this, and it's really interesting as a historian. A lot of people have often ignored much of the Great War and the interwar period because it ultimately led to another war and didn't quite make the world safe, again, safeguarded against war. Now, actually, I'm going to go here first. Sorry. I added these slides about halfway through the reception because I wanted to give you a global picture of the war in terms of the soldiers. Not just in India. I'll focus on India, but I wanted to give you a sense. The British Empire, the French Empire, when they went to war, their colonies went to war with them. 2 million Africans served in the war as soldiers or laborers recruited by the British, French, and Germans, and 10% of those people died. The French deployed 500,000 colonial soldiers on the Western Front. The British deployed 138,000 in Europe and 800,000 in the Middle East. And India alone contributed 1.4 million in the war. That is a significant number. 2/3 of them were soldiers, 70,000 of them died, 100,000 were wounded. These are staggering figures for an often forgotten contribution to the First World War. And so I wanted to, before I talk specifically about the Indian soldier, just give you some images here. Troops from the Belgian Congo, African troops from the Belgian Congo, Senegalese troops in France in June 1917, Moroccan soldiers fighting for France on the Western Front, Chinese labor battalions on the Western Front, about 140,000 laborers sent by China after it joined the war in 1917, and Indian soldiers wearing gas masks on the Western Front. So colonies fought for their empires. And here we have British propaganda. Are we afraid? No, in 1915, British war propaganda. If you see here, you have the British bulldog in the middle, but its most important and critical allies and colonies are forming sort of the flag, right? You see Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, and New Zealand. So the British at the time knew that India and the rest of their colonies were incredibly valuable to the war effort. I would even argue the British would not have been as successful as they were without Indian manpower and Indian resources. So I want to give a little bit of a history of Indian soldiers or Indian sepoys, because the Indian sepoy has a rich history in British India dating back to the origins of the British Empire in 1757. Since the advent of British rule in India, beginning with the East India Company's acquisition of Bengal after 1757, and later Bombay, Madras, and then the interior, the Indian sepoy remained significant. They served as the police and the military within the colonial state. It was the ratio of British to Indian soldiers was 6-1. So there were 6 Indian sepoys for every 1 British soldier or officer. So this was quite substantial. So you could argue, and some historians have, that the British Empire in fact depended on Indian soldiers from its very origins, and not simply just as an outcome of the Great War. Now, for those of you here who know a little bit about Indian history, there was an uprising in 1857 that radically changed the relationship between Indian soldiers and the British, as well as India's relationship with Britain. In 1857, there are a number of events that converged to bring about this uprising, some of which was general discontent with the East India Company and the way in which it ruled the colony. But it was also a very localized event that had to do with the Indian Army. In 1857, a new rifle was introduced, and the cartridges that had to be loaded by pulling it with your mouth, and it was rumored these cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which was offensive to both Indian Muslims as well as Indian Hindus. So the very localized event that erupted into the uprising of 1857 had to do with an Indian sepoy mutiny against their commanding officers over the use of these new cartridges. But historians have debated about whether it was this particular incident or widespread concern. There were also calls to return to an older empire that existed before the East India Company. I don't want to get into details so much as to sort of note that the Indian Mutiny lived on in the memory of the British for quite some time. And it also changed the Indian Army, the British Indian Army. Rather than 6 Indian soldiers to every 1 British, there would now be a new ratio of 2 Indian soldiers to every 1 British. Still sort of highlighting the importance of the Indian soldier. And that recruitment would be based on those who were loyal to the East India Company during the revolt. And so here we have the types of men enlisted into the frontier forces regiments, and this is in 1938. So this idea or conceptualization that there were certain groups within Indian society who could be trusted and who were more militant than others. It was this sort of colonial construction of the martial races, is what they called them. Certain Indians, and here you have sort of a representation of the 4 major groups of Indian soldiers that were highly recruited, who were thought to have been somehow better prepared genetically or racially for military, but who not coincidentally were loyal during the uprising of 1857. So there were other things that happened after the uprising. The East India Company was dissolved, and the Queen became the Empress of India shortly thereafter, and India was ruled directly from London through the Parliament and the India Office. There were other things that had dramatic effects on India. The Indian taxpayers were asked to pay for the British Indian Army after 1857. That if the British were going to stay in India, that they needed an army, and they needed an army that would be paid for with Indian taxpayer money, which primarily came from land revenue. So annually, about 17 to 18 million pounds was sent from India to Britain to cover the costs of the Secretary of State in London, the cost of wars at home and abroad, and the cost of the British Indian Army, as well as the pensions of officers and civil servants. This was going to be expensive by the time the Great War comes. And so these sorts of things really shifted the Indian sepoys' relationship, or the Indian soldiers' relationship with Britain. The other major shift after the uprising is that Britain asked the British Indian Army to serve outside of India. This was pretty controversial, but ultimately it happened. And so Indian soldiers were not simply stationed in India, they were stationed around the British Empire, beginning in the late 19th century, in places as far flung as China. So the point sort of is that Indian soldiers have a long and rich history already within Britain and the British Empire, well before the First World War. So when the First World War erupts, as I've already mentioned, 1.4 million Indians served. They served in France, they served in Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Palestine, East and West Africa. Soldiers were stationed in Southeast Asia. Entirely Indian regiments took places like Jerusalem and Iraq. So they were really essential. They fought in some of the most important battles in the Western Front. And I'll do my best to answer questions about which ones those are. Indians were 1/3 of the British line in France. They fought in some of the most important battles, the Battle of Somme, for example. The first Indian soldiers to be awarded the Victoria Cross took place in World War I, which is an honor for service. And so there were 16 of those awarded to Indian soldiers in the Great War. Now, the Great War did some things that overturned the 1857 sort of moment. As I said before, I've been sort of tracing this ratio. This ratio changed once again. Indian soldiers became 5 Indian soldiers to 1 British officer or soldier. And it's the first time in the First World War that Indian soldiers are allowed to handle artillery since the uprising of 1857. So a lot of things changed. But what's also really interesting is, as we know, many of the European regiments experienced significant loss. And the Indians did as well. The Indian Army, the British Indian Army, grew to 2.5 million soldiers by the end of the war. It was the largest in the world without a draft. So it's really important to think about how the First World War, in many ways, had created a very professional, a very powerful, all-volunteer army in this moment. One that remained among the most professional and one of the most largest all the way through to 1947. And when India gained its independence in 1947, stability was often assured by these soldiers and contingents. So as I mentioned earlier, also, the government of India paid for these soldiers with tax revenue from Indian taxpayers, but they also supported the war in other ways. They supplied ammunitions, factories, particularly on the western coast of India, cropped up to create ammunitions, and clothing for their uniforms, cloth for their uniforms, became a major product that was shipped out to the war front, alongside a tremendous corps of volunteers who also helped. So I think it's also important to note that it wasn't just Indian soldiers who supported this First World War. Luminary figures like Mohandas Gandhi left South Africa in 1915 for India, and he recruited Indian soldiers and volunteers to join the war campaign. So this was a fairly widespread net that supported the British wartime effort and supported the British Empire for the cause. So I have here documenting sepoy experiences. One of the sort of tricky things is how to find out how Indians experienced this war, particularly soldiers on the battlefront. They were not unlike European soldiers, fighting in the trenches, fighting alongside their European counterparts, and experiencing the horrors of this devastating war. Yet many of these men were semi or non-literate and did not leave behind the abundance of diaries, poems, memoirs that form this sort of cornerstone in the canon of the European war memory. I'm thinking All is Quiet on the Western Front, for example. But there's an enormous literature, right, that it still exists and is published and out in the world. But what the Indian troops did leave were some letters. And these letters are interesting because they weren't necessarily letters collected in an archive. While Indian troops were utilized on the Western Front and in the Middle East, their letters were subject to the British censor. The British were tracking these letters and reading them. So this has left us with a voluminous collection of flawed but existing letters. Flawed because the originals no longer exist, and because they were copied and represent only a portion of the letters that were actually sent back to India, and also because they were flagged and selected and archived by the British. And so it's oftentimes difficult to really understand from the very small fragments. It's a fragmented history of the Indian experience. A lot of these letters and images, these are actual images from the British Library collection. If you go to the British Library, you can find an abundance of images. Many of the images are actually, were commissioned by photographers who were creating wartime propaganda. And again, the letters are also just fragmented pieces of what the British colonial state thought was important to flag. So we have a hard time of really understanding the full picture, but we can make some assumptions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we can know as historians. And I do want to mention that at the end I will have a list of sources for further reading, and there is a collection of some of these fragmented letters that have been published in 1999. So these letters were often dictated by the sepoys and written down by scribes and then translated and extracted by the British censors. But their fragments do survive. And we see in this example something that isn't quite all that surprising. I don't know how clear it is. It says, you know, a Punjabi Muslim writes, let's see, I don't know if I can read it from there. I am telling you the trouble, what can I say of the war? It is a manifestation of divine wrath. Let's see, there is no counting the number of lives lost. We have to deal with the terrible and powerful enemy who is completely equipped with every sort of contrivance. Out of the 84th Regiment, which arrived in full strength, only about 10 men are left. Give you a sense of the kinds of experiences faced by Indians alongside their European counterparts. What we also know is that the Indian sepoys served the British Empire, and they served willingly, and they served alongside their British counterparts. This is an image taken, let's see, sorry, let me start that over. They fought alongside their British counterparts in the trenches. Lord Hardinge in the House of Lords said the Indian troops had arrived, quote, in the nick of time. I talk about the desperate situation that Britain faced and the importance of India's arrival at the beginning of the war. This is an image of the British and Indian soldiers playing football in France with French children watching, and it's part of the wartime propaganda that was commissioned by Britain. We do know, even if this is propaganda, that Indian soldiers work closely with and in comradeship with the British on the Western Front. But it's interesting, and there's a really great book by, let's see, do I have it here? No, sorry. There's a really great book on by Gajendra Singh, who talks about a double vision. And that the Indian soldier lived in two worlds. They lived as sharing a military culture and a service with their British imperial comrades, right, or their soldiers. But at the same time, they were distinctly Indian. And this is obvious in a number of experiences they were seen as part of the British military with a similar system of military law, regulations, and bureaucracy. This is from Gajendra Singh. At the same time, they represented what was different. They were recognizably Indian to their British counterparts. It was this double vision, British soldier and Indian identity, that made their experience of war unique. For example, Indian sepoys are often stationed in military quarters located between the British barracks and Indian towns in India. They were in between. They were sort of middlemen. They were not 100% British, but also sort of separate from their Indian towns. And so when we see this experience, this propaganda of the Indian sepoy, right, playing football with British soldiers under, the watchful eye of French children, what we also see and what we also have documents from at the British Library are the ways that Indians were treated after they were injured. And these are images from a hospital in Brighton where those who were injured were sent, if they survived, and these were separate quarters for Indian soldiers. So as historians have noted, the India Office and War Office wanted Indian soldiers to receive the same level of care as their British counterparts, yet in separate quarters. And they justify it by offering Indian-style food for their tastes and an Indian-style pavilion and for the hospital so that the fighters could feel at home. Burial rites were also observed according to their respective religions. Yet at the same time, these fragmented letters that were censored reveal that the hospitals were surrounded by barbed wire, that their trips outside the facility were chaperoned by government officials, that many of the injured in Brighton felt like they were prisoners. So this sort of idea of living in sort of two moments, right? A soldier serving the British Empire, but also being treated separately, differently, almost like a prisoner, kind of coexisted in their experience, which also makes it a complicated experience of being a soldier. Okay. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about, if I talked a little bit about Indian experiences, their contributions, I want to talk a little bit about commemoration, and I was talking about this in the reception as well. The recent centennial of the end of the war and its peace have opened up new discussions about commemorating soldiers, and much of this commemoration, as historians have already noted, focus on Europe and the Western Front. It's not necessarily wrong to do so, right? These battles were important and their experiences were important too. Yet commemorating global contributions, and especially those from India, remains important. And this is the most visible symbol commemorating Indian soldiers in the India Gate, built in 1931 by Edwin Lutyens, who was the primary architect of Delhi and the imperial city. Now, Delhi was planned, the capital was planned to sort of symbolize imperial power. And the India Gate, in many ways, also occupies this dual sort of double vision. We see the style as symbolic of empire. The triumphal arch really sort of takes us back to Rome and various places of conquest across Europe as symbols of imperial power and victories and conquest, which is an interesting selection for commemorating Indian soldiers who fell in World War I. But it does commemorate the fallen. The British Indian Army is commemorated with approximately 13,000 names of Indian and British officers and soldiers. So it is both a symbol of the service, of the lives lost, as well as the British Empire in that sort of vision, that double vision. Okay. So I want to briefly take us in a totally different direction now that I've talked a little bit about Indian soldiers, as I sort of had promised I would do. And I want to talk about another perspective. While World War I offered new opportunities to challenge the British Empire, it also offered new opportunities to challenge the British Empire. And not all Indians believed that the British should rule India, and they often sought to challenge rather than support the war effort, or at least use the war as a means to challenge colonial rule in India. I just want to take these two brief examples to give you an alternative view of the Indian experience of the Great War. Many of, these are the key members of the Committee for Indian Independence in Berlin. In Germany, the German war effort aim was to disrupt colonial rule in British, French, and Russian empires, and in doing so, divert attention and resources away from European theaters in cases of instability. So in other words, if the British had to put down a revolt in India, then their resources might be diverted. They were especially interested in undermining British rule in India, Britain's largest and most important colony, and of course, one of the key contributors to the war effort. And so this Committee for Indian Independence in Berlin was actually a scheme that started with Max von Oppenheim, who was an archaeologist and a lawyer, and who devised a scheme for a committee that would bring together German funds and Indian anti-colonial revolutionaries. And so he was able to contact and invite to Berlin Har Dayal, who's from the Khadr Party. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this party. They're based on the West Coast in San Francisco, founded in 1913, with a strong anti-colonial it was an anti-colonial movement, a revolutionary movement. It really was based on a number of Hindu intellectuals and Sikh workers. And their experience on the West Coast in the United States was one of racial discrimination. They had asked the British consulate for help, and the British consulate didn't really do a whole lot for them, and it really had radicalized a number of them on the West Coast. So we have Indians from the West Coast in the United States. We have German funds. There's actually this committee was attached to the German Foreign Office. So this was a government-run plan. And then we have Viren Chattopadhyay, who also was an exile of empire. So he was in London and was exiled from empire because he was a member of the India House, which was implicated in an attempted assassination of a colonial official. So he essentially wound up in Berlin and working with the German government to do a number of projects. They were very much interested in disseminating anti-British propaganda among soldiers stationed in the Middle East, in what is Ottoman territory, and Singapore, where Indian sepoys launched a mutiny in 1915 that lasted for 9 days and required the British to call upon reinforcements from their allies, the French, the Japanese, and the Russians, for 9 days. In all, 203 Indian soldiers were court-martialed, 202 convicted. Of those, 41 were executed, 63 were transported for life, and the rest sentences ranged from 6 weeks to 20 years. 52 Indians died and 72 British soldiers died in the mutiny. Now, the evidence in the investigation revealed that German POWs stationed in Singapore had encouraged the mutiny, and the Berlin Committee agents, alongside their Indian revolutionary counterparts, had sent agents to circulate anti-British propaganda and inflame tensions between Indian officers and British commanders. So while the mutiny itself failed, and Singapore was not a site during the First World War, it really did wreak havoc on the British Empire at a really critical moment in time for the British wartime effort. Among their other schemes was the SS Maverick, which was an attempt to ship ammunitions to India. And in fact, the story is really quite interesting. The SS Maverick is a story of German money, Indian revolutionaries, and secret rendezvous, according to a historian, Heather Street Salter. In early 1915, a German shipping company commissioned the Maverick. The crew included American Germans and 5 Indian revolutionaries posing as Persian waiters. They set sail in April 1915 from the west coast of California, stopping just off the Acapulco coast, where it was to rendezvous with another ship named the Annie Larson. The Annie Larson was carrying ammunition, 30,000 revolvers and rifles, and anti-British propaganda to be circulated in India. The captain of the Annie Larson was to take command of the Maverick. They were to sail into Dutch neutral waters and then on to India. However, when the Maverick stopped off the coast of Acapulco, they waited 29 days and the Annie Larson never came. Of course, British, French, and Dutch colonial intelligence authorities were hot on their heels in those 29 days. And so the Maverick was ultimately detained in the Dutch ports and held there throughout the duration of the war. The Annie Larsen, they didn't have the ammunition, so they had no proof that they were actually trying to ship ammunition to India. However, the Annie Larsen was detained. And that's an image from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1915. Now, these stories tell us about a radical sort of minority group operating outside of India. But the world was their theater in the World War. And I think that's important to remember, that these sorts of struggles against colonialism were also going on at the same time, and not everyone experienced the Great War quite the same way. So that's why I like to sort of add a different kind of perspective. But overall, the majority in India and the Indian soldiers supported the British Empire and its cause in the Great War. But what's interesting and what's striking is that the war ended in 1918, right? The peace settlement by 1919. And by 1920, India had launched its first major anti-colonial campaign against the British, the non-cooperation movement, right? Gandhi led his first non-violent movement within a year. So what happens? In many ways, the outcomes of the Great War shaped the anti-colonial resistance that would follow. It was the disappointments of the war that often came to play an enormous role in the ways in which anti-colonial resistance emerged immediately afterward in 1920. And between 1920 and 1947, 3 massive civil disobedience campaigns took place, the largest the British Empire's ever seen, and probably the world. So what happened? What did the Great War ultimately do in India? It shaped it in profound ways. And the first way, I take us back to this poor soldier who just described the manifestation of divine wrath, right, in strong language about how traumatic these events were. Well, what happened in these letters that returned home and in these Indian soldiers that returned home, they came carrying stories. They came carrying stories about the brutality of the Germans, the French, the British, right? And that maybe perhaps some of the ideas that the British had professed in the 19th century and the lead up to the First World War were maybe not quite accurate. The 19th century was the heyday of empire, and it was also a time in which Europeans, and the British in particular, had professed a civilizing mission. They said, we are here in the colonial world to civilize the colonies, that we are the ultimate civilization, and that we're going to teach civilization to the world. And what we have in these stories, right, are those who witness not civilization, something much more destructive. And so it began to chip away at this notion of how the British justified colonial rule in India and across the empire. So this was really critical. The soldiers themselves carrying back some of these stories. Economically, the war in many ways had changed India's economy in so many ways. So the war had encouraged industrial output for wartime resources, and there was a decline in agricultural output. Okay? At the same time, the British demanded more tax revenue and tax revenue came from agriculture. So as there's a decline in agriculture, the British are squeezing over an extra 100 million pounds in taxes for the war. This was devastating for rural India, for peasants, for farmers. To pay the expenses of the Indian Army, the taxes that paid for the Indian Army went up 300% in order to fund the Great War. Add to this wartime inflation, prices are up through the roof, food shortages. So the peasants and the farmers suffered tremendously long before we begin to see the the repercussions of the Great Depression, for example, or the famines that occurred fairly regularly in the colonial period, and particularly after World War I. There's a second dimension to that, too. The Indian industry produced war supplies like uniforms and ammunition, and they began to profit, and those factories began to churn. And as they were making up the difference for Britain in many ways, they began to develop independence from British industry for the first time in many ways since the East India Company had consolidated its rule. And so what we see here at the end of the war, right, we begin to see the end of colonial control over the industrial economy, as well as we see the seeds of massive poverty and famine that would follow, ones that would be a really important purpose for anti-colonial resistance. So those pieces are really important to the impact of the war. There's also a political side to the story. While anti-colonial resistance was not widespread during the war, the outcomes of the war had prompted a stronger position against the British. Now this is, this relates in many ways to the global sort of story, right? If you see this, we have like a ship and everyone's getting on the SS Self-Determination, right? Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, right? That we're fighting a war and the peace will bring national self-determination. And it says, so the SS Self-Determination is the new route from autocracy to freedom. It's now sailing immediately after the Great War. But what we have here at the bottom of the picture, and I want to note the source is Aras Manella's Wilsonian Moment. It was just an excellent book on this very disappointment. We have an Indian woman packing her bags ready to get on the SS Self-Determination. And Captain Wilson says, hello, what about India? And the passport officer, Lloyd George, says, no passport. So in other words, India didn't have a passport on the SS Self-Determination and its route from autocracy to freedom. But this played out, and it was a major disappointment because there were promises made during the war. In 1917, for example, Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, had announced that the British intention to move toward, quote, gradual development of self-governing institutions and responsible government for India. He called the educated in India, quote, the intellectually our children who, quote, imbibed ideas which we ourselves have already set before them. That was in 1917, right? But what ultimately happened was quite the opposite. Well, this was a war to end all wars and make it, a world safe for democracy, and to promise self-determination. The Wilsonian moment ended in disappointment. India did not gain any self-determination or any steps towards self-governing, if you even went with the more sort of formal declaration by Montagu. So this Wilsonian moment ended in grave disappointment for India and many colonies around the world. India was a charter member of the League of Nations. However, the representatives were not those of the Indian National Congress and those active Indian leaders, but rather representatives of the Indian civil service who served the British Empire. So even in that sort of marginal victory, real power was always secured in the hands of the British colonial system. And of course, the war directly impacted one of the massacres that took place in India. The Amritsar massacre, or the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, was an outcome of a few things. So during the war, the British had introduced these very repressive acts. They banned Indians from public assembly, from freedom of speech, of press, of their basic civil liberties during wartime to prevent any kind of sedition or outbreak of resistance. So after the war, the British colonial state decided to introduce the Rollout Acts of 1919, which continued these repressive measures. So rather than offering self-determination and self-government, they introduced measures that limited or curtailed their right to assembly, their right to speech, and the press, and civil liberties more generally. In this particular massacre, there's a monument for the massacre on the left and then a dramatization of it on the right. Happened in the city of Amritsar in Punjab, where a public meeting, a nonviolent meeting, was held in an enclosed section of the city called the Jallianwala Bagh. The gathering was illegal according to the Rowlatt Acts, but nevertheless peaceful. General Reginald Dyer commanded his men to open fire on the crowd on April 13, 1919, to disperse it. 370 men, women, and children were trapped inside and killed, and 1,000 were wounded. Dyer was forced to resign from his post in India, but he returned to Britain as a hero with a $30,000 reward and a hero's parade. So, for Indians who were astonished by the blatant act of violence toward unarmed men, women, and children, Amritsar symbolized in many ways everything that was wrong with colonial rule. Coupled with the disappointment of the peace settlements and the stories of returning soldiers, it was the perfect storm for the 1920 non-cooperation campaign. But it was directly related to the outcomes of the wars and all of its manifestations in India. So then we have sort of, and I always put this up for my students, it's M.K. Gandhi, attorney at law in the service of the empire. That's what he's in South Africa. And in many ways serving the empire throughout the First World War and the new nationalism after 1919 and the disappointments of the Great War. A final comment, and then I'll be finished. I hope I didn't go too far over time or no one's sleeping. So I wrote a book on Nehru, who's the first prime minister of India, who was an independence leader throughout the 20s and 30s. And later in the 1920s, it was widely recognized, or it became widely recognized, that the First World War had been a war between imperialist powers from the standpoint of India, and not a war for national self-determination. And this, I think, is really clear in Nehru's speech before an international congress called the Colonial Congress Against Imperialism and for National Independence. It's a tongue twister. In 1927. So this is much later, but it shows the importance of the war, the importance of the troops, and the importance of the ways in which we remember that war and the anti-colonial struggle. So he says, Indian troops unhappily, and to my shame, I must confess it, have been utilized many times by the British in oppressing other people. They have been to Egypt, to Abyssinia, and the Persian Gulf, to Mesopotamia, Arabia, Syria, Georgia, Tibet, Afghanistan, and Burma. In many ways, sort of listing many of these global sort of depots that they were before the World War and during the World War. And he goes on to say, the independence struggle in India is not purely a national problem, but that it affects a large number of other countries directly and the whole world indirectly. And it was largely because, in his mind in 1927, of the Indian soldiers that came to be stationed around the world, largely right before the Great War and also as a consequence of the Great War. So sacrifices of soldiers were never forgotten, not even in this moment, but they came to have new meaning in 1927 as a critique of the war's outcome rather than one of service. So the sacrifices of the soldiers, ultimately, it was the sacrifices of the soldiers and the failures of the war to offer freedom to those who had paid the ultimate price that became really important to India in the 1920s and informs the anti-colonial movement. So that's all I have in terms of question, or I'm ready to open up the floor to questions. I did want to point out some of the sources. The British Library collection is tremendously valuable in thinking about Indian soldiers and colonial soldiers more broadly. The published Indian soldiers sources, this idea of the double vision comes out of Gajendra Singh's work. The Maverick and the Indian Mutiny is a recent book on Southeast Asia in World War I, but there's a lot of India in that Southeast Asian story. And so a few other books. Mine's the last one, which is primarily begins in 1927, so a bit later. So.
microphone possible, or I'll ask you to repeat the question before you answer. Okay? Yes.
Here, Bill.
Here's it. Thank you.
With respect to the India service in World War II, there's kind of a divisive opinion in India about the soldiers. And I wondered if that happened in World War I as well.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, there was two opinions. Some really feel that they shouldn't have fought in World War II, and the soldiers then were in some ways respected for what they did among
yeah.
a percentage of the population. I wonder if that was true in World War I as well.
So, I mean, I think that some of these people who are working with the Germans during World War I would have been highly critical of the service in World War I. But I think, by and large, there was a strong current of support for the war, and a strong current of disappointment after the war that it didn't really change anything. I mean, the war disappointed a lot of people in India and outside. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress were all primarily supporting the war. Yeah.
Will you just repeat the question that you asked?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, he was just asking if in World War I there was a current of the population that didn't support the war. And a lot of the Indian revolutionaries that were working in the United States and in Germany, I would say, definitely didn't support this, the soldiers and the service in the war. Yeah. But there was definitely a lot more resistance to the Second World War, as he mentioned. In fact, the Indian National Congress and all of its leadership launched the Quit India movement because they weren't consulted. And instead Britain declared war for India when the Second World War started.
Microphone.
I think I'm attached to this wall, so.
Was a military draft ever instituted in India to recruit soldiers?
In the First World War, no.
It was always all volunteer.
Yeah, in this particular war, yeah. I'm not sure about World War II, actually, but in World War I, in World War I, there was no draft, yeah. You also have to remember that these were high-paid jobs in the colonial state. I mean, you earned a really good pension, and those images of sort of the martial races and the recruiting of certain groups, it was kind of an honor to be recruited. So there was definitely a lot of benefit. But they were also, I mean, the question becomes, were they fighting for the British Empire? Were they fighting because they were mercenary soldiers that were paid, And that's hard to get at with the fragmented sources that we have as well.
Is there a question over here? Did the Indian soldiers have Indian officers or British officers?
Typically, it would be British officers, yeah. The British always maintained the command, both in the colonial state but also in the military. So those ratios are typically commanders versus soldiers.
There is one engagement of World War I that has particularly caught my attention.
Okay.
And that is at Katib el-Kel in the Sinai Desert, when the Turkish troops were attempting to reach the Suez Canal, and they were turned back by the Bikaner Camel Corps, personally led by Ganga Singh, whom I had a personal acquaintance with.
Oh, great.
He became one of the two Indian delegates at the peace conference in Versailles, and he personally, and this is described in a book by, I think his name is Hugh Purcell.
Okay.
He personally argued with Wilson that India deserves membership in the League of Nations.
Yeah.
And as I say, he was one of the two Indian delegates at the conference. I have a book here which contains a photograph of Ganga Singh taken by my father.
Wow.
My parents were present at the wedding of the granddaughter of the Maharaja of Bikaner, February 29, 1940.
Wow, that's so cool.
And I have that.
Can I see that?
Well, in this book is the photograph,
Great.
and also a photograph of a Christmas card from the Maharaja to my parents, where he's shown over his 200th tiger that he shot dead.
Wow, wow.
That's what he selected for his Christmas card.
I mean, the other thing that's really sort of complicated that there's just no way that I can sort of cover here is the relationship between the princes and the princely states and the Indian National Congress, which was directly ruled by Britain. There's a whole 1/3 of India that comprised of these smaller princely states. And their relationship and experiences were quite different, right? And this, in this instance, is because the Indian National Congress, of course, is upset. The Indian National Congress is the main institution that led the independence campaign, and after 1920, under Gandhi's leadership. But they were always critical, or not, of the princely states, or their exclusion from the peace agreements.
Ganga Singh favored self-rule but not independence.
Yeah. And most Indians would have agreed with that in 1920. It's not until the first independence resolution within the Indian National Congress is 1927. It's Nehru who introduces it.
I have some in the back there.
I was curious, were the Indian soldiers and the British soldiers given the same weapons when they were fighting the war?
Were they given?
The same weapons when they were fighting the war, or was there a difference in the weapons which were given to the British officers versus the Indian soldiers?
I don't have an exact answer to that in terms of their artillery, other than they were able to use the artillery. I assume that they used the same weapons. They fought in the trenches together. In many cases, and so, and oftentimes, the British were fairly clear that the Indians had kind of, come in the nick of time to sort of save the day, which is a really sort of a turn on some of these narratives, right, in which the British are the colonizer and India is the colonizer, the weaker, in the imperial relationship. They were really important. So I would assume that they used the same artillery, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
Were the Indian units separated by religion?
No. They were often separated, so after 1857, they were separated regionally and mixed up because it was thought after the uprising in 1857 that it was because of these regional sort of alliances to their Maharajas and various other rulers. But they weren't separated by their religion, no. And they're in the hospital, and there's some images of some burial grounds and cremation grounds. So the hospitals were sort of handling various, rituals and burial ceremonies in a place like Brighton.
Thank you so much for your talk. This was really interesting. I have a question about sources.
Yeah.
And obviously, British Library is a vast treasure trove of resources, especially related to anything to do with the British Empire and the Raj, per se. Other than that, it's really hard to find information which is not necessarily through the British perspective of the Raj. So other than the British Library, what would be a couple of reliable or big sources of information?
Well, the tricky part is, and that sort of is central. So the question is, are there sources outside of the British sources? In the colonial period, the colonial state collected a lot of sources, and some of them were from the British perspective, like these fragments of these letters and whatnot. You could probably find some of these letters in the National Archives of India. It just depends on if people saved them and deposited them. I was reading some other historians who talk a fair amount about various like things that are scattered in Australia and in France that have like artifacts of Indian soldiers, that you can find, but it is very hard to find that voice. There are no doubt some of those in the National Archives, and certainly you can find a whole lot in India and published on like some of the elite Indians who would have written about the war, like Gandhi, but also Nehru and various other Indian National Congress leaders. That doesn't probably get at the Indian soldier's perspective, if that's the question you're asking. That's the primary set of sources. I believe the Cambridge University collection is maybe like a recovery project, so they might have more than the censorship ones. Yeah.